Hi, everyone, and welcome to this coffee break briefing. My name is Katie Auth. I'm the Policy Director at the Energy for Growth Hub. And today we're talking with Todd Moss, the Hub's Executive Director, about recommendations he and I are putting out today for the upcoming congressional reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC, and how to make it stronger, more flexible, and more impactful. So I wanted to stress three things before we get started. The first is that just for background context, in terms of how both Todd and I are coming at this, he was deeply involved, along with Ben Leo, in the original push to create and design the DFC. And I worked closely with DFC when I was at USAID Power Africa for many years. And I saw firsthand how impactful that they could be, but also how challenging it can be for the DFC to actually find good deals and structure them and get them across the finish line. The second thing that we wanted to flag is that Todd and I wrote these recommendations together, but we didn't totally agree on everything during the process of writing them. So we had a lot of really fun, constructive debate, not only between ourselves, but also with people inside the DFC about what makes sense and what doesn't. And we're hoping that in the process of the Q&A and some of the discussion that Todd and I have, we can give you an inside look at some of that debate and where he and I kind of struggled with stuff. Third is that we know there are tons of groups putting out their own reauthorization lists right now. I'm sure you've received several of them in your inboxes already. And one of the key challenges, I think, for the DFC right now is that there are so many competing visions and expectations for what it should be, from Congress, from the administration, from external groups like us. It's kind of been all things to all people since it was created almost 5 years ago. And I think one of the most interesting things we're going to see play out in this reauthorization process is hopefully a real conversation about what do we really want this agency to be, and what is the vision for what its core mandate should be and what it should achieve moving forward. So during today's discussion, I'm going to start by asking Todd to walk us through the recommendations themselves, but we want to hear your questions as well. So at any point in the presentation, if you have questions, please just submit them via the Q&A box and I'll pepper them into the conversation. And with that, we'll just get started. So Todd, my first question is, because you were involved in the original creation of the DFC, can you talk a little bit about what your biggest concern was at the time for what might ultimately derail or make it difficult for DFC to achieve its goals?
Am I unmuted now? Okay,
You are
thanks.
unmuted. Yeah.
And as always, it was fun doing this project with you. I think the thing I was always worried about is that the expectations were so huge that the agency was just going to get pulled apart by people who wanted it to, to support U.S. investors or to counter China or to, have good development outcomes. And we saw a lot of mixed messages coming from Congress, and different parts of the government have different goals for DFC. And I do think that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about this morning, is the ways that the agency can get pulled apart. And I'd say in particular, one thing I worried about is that it was very helpful to have the motivation to create the DFC, the concern that the U.S. or the need for the U.S. to provide an alternative to Chinese investment, particularly Belt Road. But also, so it's useful to have that as a motivation, but trying to counter China on a transaction by transaction basis is actually a terrible way for the U.S. to make decisions. So I worried that motivation could actually have harmful effects on the operations of the agency and the ultimate outcomes of what they're trying to achieve. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll touch a bit later on kind of how that in particular has played out, because the countering China narrative is certainly, if anything, becoming a bigger part of how people think about DFC.
For sure.
My second question is maybe for folks who aren't familiar with the reauthorization process, like, why is now such a critical time to be having these conversations about the agency's structure and its future?
Yeah. So look, I mean, the DFC is like one of the most important tools the US government has for, for development outcomes, for supporting national security, for our global economic goals, and for our environment and climate goals. Like we just need the DFC to be functioning and doing all of the stuff we want it to do. And the flip side is if the DFC is ineffective or it's not doing enough, the US government is kind of impotent to help allies with energy security, to promote job growth, to really spur the energy transition. And frankly, all of our talk about providing a credible alternative to China or Russia is empty talk without the DFC. So we really need it to be functional. And one thing I would just say, I'm really glad that you flagged that there are lots of people in town, in particular in Washington, that are focused on DFC and have lots of ideas. And I saw the Clear Path has a good list, and I know CSIS has a list. I would expect several others to come out. I really hope that DFC understands that these are all allies trying to help make the agency better and not be defensive. There can be a tendency in the U.S. government to see every criticism as existential, and this is really a very, very supportive ecosystem. So they should. I hope they feel fortunate to have all of those groups, and I hope they take the suggestions with that spirit.
You and I released a total of 8 recommendations. And for everybody watching, we're going to put that out right after this, so people will be able to read the full text of what we're proposing. But can you just very quickly kind of walk through the outlines of what we're putting forward?
Yeah, so we tried to have sort of 3 themes of what we thought could be helpful during a reauthorization, which is just a very important time to look at ways that we can revisit DFC's, the original congressional intent, and fix as needed the mandate and capabilities of the agency. So the 3 big buckets. One is we call it release the shackles. And this is that Congress clearly intended DFC to have new tools, but a lot of rules are blocking the use of those tools to their full potential. And really, DFC's success is going to be built around flexibility, simplicity, and speed. And so they're going to need these tools to be released. So that's the first bucket. The second is keeping the focus on development. The BUILD Act was very explicit that the primary mandate is to facilitate inclusive economic growth in in capital-starved markets in the lower income countries. It's not an accident that development is in the title. So we really want to try to make sure that the focus stays on development while also being realistic that DFC is expected to respond to other international crises, other national security priorities. But I think it's, the agency can walk and chew gum at the same time. The DFC can counter Chinese or Russian influence without losing its core mandate. And then the third bucket, we work every day on energy. So the third bucket is really around equipping DFC to help tackle the energy challenges of today and be ready to tackle those energy challenges tomorrow. And we've got some specific ideas on how they can do that, which I'm sure we'll get into.
So 3 buckets. Let's kind of walk through them one at a time. And then I have some non-softball questions for Todd that we can dig into. But let's start with the release the shackles category first.
Yeah, so under release the shackles, we've got 4 suggestions here, recommendations, and these are things that Congress really and only Congress can do. So one is unlocking more capital by raising the maximum contingent liability to 60 billion. It's to 100 billion. It's currently at 60 billion. 100 billion would just give a lot more headroom to the agency. It would cost 0 to taxpayers, so this is not an appropriation. It's just a maximum limit. And importantly, adding this. They're not quite hitting that headroom, that limit yet, but having a higher limit would allow the agency to do larger individual projects because the legislation currently limits any one project to 5% of the total. So theoretically, they could go up to 5 billion by lifting the max to 100 billion. The second one is fixing the scoring rules. There was a clear congressional intent to give DFC the ability to make equity investments. The way that equity investments are being scored in the budget means that they're being treated like grants, and effectively you can only really do small equity investments. So that needs to be fixed. That's an accounting issue. That also applies, through this process, we learned that this is also impacting political risk insurance, which is a really important tool. So those accounting and budget rules need to be fixed, and the reauthorization is a good vehicle for that.
And I just want to flag, especially for those who kind of haven't been following the equity scoring issue, it sounds incredibly arcane, and it is. It is an accounting rule, but it's a surprisingly difficult rule to address and a contentious one. So this isn't just a kind of bureaucratic, it's not an accounting mechanism that can easily, it's a debate. But yeah,
exactly. But if you look across all other peers that DFC has, all the other development finance institutions, nobody scores equity at 0, which is the way we've decided to do that. They treat it that it has a market value, and that's how you would score it. And that's what DFC would need to really utilize this tool. And I'll be really quick on the other. So the third is that right now, DFC has to notify Congress of every project that's at least $10 million. A nice CSIS analysis shows that this means 2/3 of projects are going to the Hill. It's just crazy inefficient for the agency and for the Hill. So that should just get lifted to 50 million. That would be a simple fix for streamlining the process. And the last one is, okay, this was a 7-year reauthorization. We could remove a lot of uncertainty and give a nice boost to the market and a good, show of force by reauthorizing DFC for 10 years this time. I think that would be 4 important signals that would really strengthen the DFC and allow the shackles to be released.
Okay, great. And the next category was about keeping the focus on development. What about that one?
Yeah, here, this was partially, we had this concern that DFC is going to get pulled into richer markets because richer markets tend to have bigger national security concerns, and they also tend to be larger markets. So you'd see a lot more deals going, bigger deals going through. And when we look at the portfolio, that's actually exactly what we are seeing. Despite the BUILD Act saying very clearly that DFC is supposed to prioritize projects in low-income or lower middle-income countries, we're actually seeing the majority of at least investment dollars going out the door, going to upper middle-income or in some cases high-income countries. So we don't, I personally don't think that the exceptions to richer countries should become the rule, but it seems like it is. Here, I think the main thing that the Hill could do is really just encourage DFC to tweak the incentives that push them into those richer markets. And 2 suggestions that we have. One is to create a traffic light system. So you could see where every project would be color coded on the income group. And then that could be aggregated at the portfolio level. So to see where are the projects, which are in the poorest countries, which are in the richer countries, we actually had to rebuild their portfolio and do all that analysis ourselves. You can see that on our website, but the board of DFC and the public shouldn't have to build their own data set. They should just be able to look quickly and say, what's the distribution between poorer and richer countries? And the other is that right now there is a policy on when the DFC will invest in upper middle income countries, but it's totally unclear what that policy is. The DFC should be more transparent. Congress should encourage, if not insist, that DFC be clear about that. And in particular, there's something called a safe harbor list, which the State Department keeps, which are sort of like pre-vetted sectors. Where if a project is in a safe harbor sector, they're automatically cleared for a waiver, even though they're in the exceptional income category. At least that list should be public. We should know exactly what it is and how broad it is.
Yeah, and the final group before we move into Q&A was about energy specifically. What's in that group?
Yeah, here DFC, we think DFC can do a lot more in the energy sector. and it needs to. And energy, obviously, we work on energy, so we think it's important, but energy is one of those things that touches national security, job creation, economic growth, climate change. I mean, whatever you care about, energy is fundamental. And clearly, the world is going to need lots more energy, and hopefully most of that will be clean. And so this is one of our tools to help spur that clean energy investment. I'd say the challenge that you and I debated a lot was for reauthorization. How much should Congress be micromanaging DFC? So these are really sort of suggestions that Congress could make to encourage DFC to do some of the things, and some of them are supportive of an ongoing internal reauthorization that's going on right now, which should help here. But I think it's worth Congress keeping a close eye on. So here there's three. One is to really proactively build a pipeline of viable energy projects. DFC is still basically passive, waiting for deals to walk in the door. That's just not good enough today. There's just not enough projects walking in the door. So we think early stage support teams, we think some looser restrictions on technical assistance grants could be helpful. And in particular, there's some interesting technologies like hydrogen, battery storage, and advanced nuclear, where DFC could really use to have a designated expert and point of contact inside the agency. So really, that's how you would build a pipeline of viable projects for the future. The next recommendation is around the climate strategy. The agency has a climate strategy, but it's been very confusing both internally to staff, to external partners and investors, and it's been very complicating diplomatically because it's just not clear what DFC will do and won't do because of the climate policy. So again, here I would lean toward disclosure and transparency as the best remedy. And so we're recommending that they publicly disclose which of the White House and State Department policies, these aren't really DFC's policies, but this is White House State Department policies on carbon intensive energy investments would affect DFC. Just to put it in plain English, like when can DFC do gas-fired power plants or LPG cook stoves? It's not clear. And really, I've heard from people saying, oh, well, of course it'll be done, and heard people say, no, we can't do that. So that there's just a lack of clarity. And you might remember not long ago, DFC announced that they would make their portfolio net zero by 2040, but they haven't really explained what that means. We haven't really heard anything about it since the announcement. So DFC should either clarify what its net zero plan is, or just rescind it, make it clear or take it away. And then the final recommendation is around nuclear power. DFC inherited a ban on nuclear from OPEC. It was a legacy rule. That was lifted in July of 2020, but really DFC has been frustrating the other agencies, the other federal agencies that have been quite aggressive on promoting nuclear power. The administration has been very, very forward-leaning on nuclear, but DFC, we've heard a lot of grumbling that DFC is sort of dragging their feet. And there's a couple of things they could do to be more forward-leaning on nuclear power. One is increase the project size. Two is to dedicate some funds to upfront studies, even if it's not necessarily going to be DFC financed, or it's not clear that DFC is definitely going to finance the project. They could participate in those technical studies. And then I think a lot of the grumbling on the Hill about DFC's dragging its feet on nuclear could be mitigated by an annual update to Congress. What are the activities? What are the letters of interest? What are the companies they're talking to? And what's the pipeline look like, even if it's prospective? So those are our 8 recommendations.
Great. So I have a couple specific questions for Todd, but just a reminder to folks, we'd love to have your questions as well. So just drop them in the chat. My first question is actually about what you just talked about, the nuclear sector. This was not a great week for the advanced nuclear sector. NuScale, which is a leading US developer of advanced nuclear technology, announced the cancellation of its first big project in Utah. Why are you still so enthusiastic, and why do you think it's so important for the US to be focused on nuclear technology overseas, especially in developing markets where, to be perfectly honest, SMRs are likely not going to be, a hugely viable solution for the next couple of years at least. Why is this so important for DFC?
Yeah. So obviously the NuScale news is disappointing. Let's keep in mind there are at least 70 nuclear companies operating in the US at different stages. This is one startup that has hit a major roadblock. So it's just one among a pretty vibrant ecosystem of nuclear technology companies. I think the main thing is when we look, and we've done a really useful map with our friends at Third Way, looking at which countries are likely to be the biggest markets for nuclear and which are taking concrete steps, not just saying they want nuclear, but taking actual steps to prepare for nuclear power. There's a huge range of countries, and most of that demand is in Asia and other emerging regions, mostly Asia. So the demand is there. And the question is are the Russians going to just grab all of this, or is the US government going to help support some of the US firms that are going to be playing in the SMR space? I still believe in it, despite the news. I'm relatively technology agnostic. I'm not just a booster of one technology over another, but I think it would be literally insane to try to take nuclear off the table. And for those markets, financing is going to be critical, and development finance institutions are going to have to get into that game, particularly in some of the emerging and frontier markets. So DFC is, purpose built for that. So why would you shy away from it?
Yeah, follow-up question from the audience on nuclear. So very candidly, kind of, are the markets that you're talking about, Ghana is one, are they actually prepared to develop nuclear? And if not, what should the US be doing to accelerate that preparation? And then if you can, just talk a little bit about the difference between advanced nuclear, SMRs, and larger scale nuclear, and like how you see that playing out for the DFC. What should they be focused on?
Okay, so I really did not want nuclear to take over this whole discussion around DFC. It's just one little corner. But look, advanced nuclear is just it's a generic term for smaller, potentially prefabricated. It's supposed to be lower cost and more flexible, which is going to be more attractive in countries that are not going to be able. They're not big enough, and they're not ready for a traditional huge 1 gigawatt reactor. Or some of the, we're seeing a huge one being built by the Russians in Egypt right now. There are very few countries that could absorb something of that size. I would say, what was that? What was the other part of your question, Katie?
Mostly just clarifying that there is a difference between
between Ghana, but also Ghana and others. Look, if you have a look at the Third Way map, there are countries that are very serious, that they've got, they're going through these milestones through the IAEA. They're negotiating things. There are countries that are extremely serious about it and taking concrete steps, and a lot of countries that have already entered the market. There's also a lot of kind of nonsense hype. There was an article in the BBC about 2 weeks ago that Burkina Faso was going to become a nuclear power because they signed some deal with Russia. I mean, that's just state propaganda. It's completely untrue. So you want to separate that in Burkina Faso from actual steps in places like Ghana or the Philippines, where there's real things happening. And you're right, it's not next year, but Ghana has, I thought, very thoughtfully planned its nuclear for sort of mid 2030s, late 2030s, to replace their gas when they think their gas production is going to start to decline. So that's 10, 12 years away, which sounds far away, but it's not too soon to start preparing and lining up the financing now, because the projects often take a while.
So getting off nuclear and going back to this question of DFC's development mandate versus its foreign policy and security mandate, our recommendations advocate for maintaining a strong focus on low and lower middle income economies. But one of the original intentions of the BUILD Act was to create an agency that could effectively quote unquote counter China. So what would you say in response to someone who argued that by limiting their ability to invest in upper middle income countries, you're actually constraining the agency's ability to effectively do that?
Yeah. So look, the Build Act now, and I'm sure through reauthorization will have a huge hole for driving projects that are going to serve national security, aims through. The issue, I would say, is not about putting like lots of new restrictions, which is why we've leaned on just disclosure. Disclose when you would do it and why and what's the justification, and make it clear to people when you're doing that. The issue is that the internal incentives within the organization, and this is not just DFC, this is basically all DFIs, is toward richer, bigger countries. Because the projects are bigger, they're less risky. But the DFC is built to go into smaller, poorer markets and to take on that risk. So you want to explicitly counteract those incentives, and that would be to try to lean on the scale to encourage more projects in the poorer countries. Because if DFC could put $500 million into India, no one would notice. But if DFC can put $500 million into a Sahelian country or a small West African country or a Caribbean island, that is transformational. So I think we really want to make sure that the agency, both the staff, the board, and their other players are all incentivized to take risk and to push as much as possible down the income ladder to the poorer markets, where we'll have a much, much bigger development effect.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in one question in 1 minute.
Okay, I'll be quick.
We talked about the tension between putting out all of these recommendations, but you also don't want Congress to legislate so much and in such detail that it actually constrains the agency's flexibility, which is vital to its success. So how would you encourage the congressional aides and the people who are actually going to be writing this legislation to think about that balance?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Look, I think that Congress has to do what they need to do, which is, raise some of the limits that we talked about. And I think Congress can also set some very clear expectations without dictating exactly what the agency should do. And I do think, like the project, the early stage project teams, which I think are absolutely crucial. I don't think an earmark or directive would be helpful from Congress. But they can encourage them to find mechanisms for more risk, and then really push management, not just through reauthorization, but through the ongoing engagement that the agency leadership has with Hill staff, and through the annual appropriations process, to encourage them to really lean into those initiatives.
Great. So that's all the time we have. Thanks to everyone who joined. Clearly, both Todd and I believe strongly in the promise of the DFC and how powerful it can be as a tool for both U.S. development and U.S. foreign policy, and are invested in its success. And we know so many other people are as well. So thanks for your questions. I'm sorry to those I didn't get to, but we'll stay in touch all this. And please look out for the actual text of our recommendations and reach out with any questions. Thanks so much.